The Cliff Racer is one of Vardenfell's most iconic creatures. Or rather, it was, thanks to Saint Jiub.
I hunted down and killed every last one of them. Took years.
Saint Jiub claims that he spent years hunting cliff racers. According to his own account, he killed every last one. The winged Menace was gone, the roads were safe, and the people of Morrowind rewarded him with sainthood. And yet, around 2 centuries later, a Nord warrior in Skyrim remembers traveling into Morrowind with her father. Their quarry included cliff racers, which apparently made for excellent sport. But how is this possible? Was Saint Jiub a liar? Did the Nord, after a bit too much mead, boast about slaying creatures that don't even exist anymore? Or did the cliff racer somehow come back after its own extinction? To understand what might have survived, we first need to identify what was supposedly destroyed. That means returning to Vardenfell near the end of the Third Era, when cliff racers were still very much alive. Approaching a cliff racer openly is not especially useful. Once it notices us, observation quickly gives way to the familiar cycle of circling, screeching and biting. Fortunately, Vardenfell offers a tool unavailable to most real-world zoologists: invisibility. Hidden from view, we can watch the animal without immediately becoming part of its hunting behavior. The cliff racer has a long, narrow body, broad, leathery wings, and an elongated tail. Contemporary accounts describe it as larger than a man. 2 tall membranes project vertically from the torso, one above the body and another below it. Its general appearance is reptilian, although some people in Morrowind also describe cliff racers as bird-like. That description may come from the plume at the end of the tail rather than from its skin or wing structure. The head is long and narrow. Its mouth resembles a beak, though the edges contain visible tooth-like structures. These may be true teeth, serrations, or simply part of the beak. In any case, the mouth appears suited to catching and holding prey. There is no obvious surface for grinding food, so smaller animals could probably be swallowed whole, while larger prey would have to be torn apart. A small horn or crest rises from the top of the skull. It is modest compared with the larger membranes on the torso, though it may still have helped with display or species recognition. The wings appear to be modified forelimbs. Most of each wing consists of a thin membrane held between the body and one very long outer structure. This looks like an elongated finger, although I did not have access to the skeleton yet, so we cannot identify the individual bones with confidence. The membrane of a vertebrate wing is known as a patagium. Across the cliff racer's patagium, we can see a branching pattern that resembles a dense system of blood vessels. The membrane is living, well-supplied tissue. The vessels could provide oxygen and nutrients while also helping with heat exchange and repairing the frequent tears that a thin flight surface would inevitably suffer. Behind the body extends the long tail. In many individuals, it is longer than the head and torso combined. At its end is a broad, feather-like vein. That vein probably plays some role in flight control. A long tail creates considerable leverage, allowing even a relatively small surface at its tip to influence the animal's direction. It may help control pitch and yaw, or simply keep the body stable while the racer circles at low speed. The material gathered from the skin of the animal is known as a racer plume. Alchemists value it for one particular property: levitation. A fact that will give us some clues later on. The torso carries 2 more unusual structures. A tall dorsal sail rises from the back, while a second, slightly smaller membrane projects from the underside. Their exact purpose is unknown. They may act as stabilizers, preventing unwanted rolling or yawing during slow flight. By changing the angle of its body, the racer could also use them for steering or slowing down. The sails may serve a social role as well. Large, visible structures often help animals identify members of their own species, attract mates or intimidate rivals. We do not see clear variation between the cliff racers encountered in Vardenfell, but the animals may differ by age, sex or condition in ways that the surviving depictions fail to show. Heat regulation is another possibility. A thin membrane containing many blood vessels could absorb warmth in the morning and release excess heat during sustained activity. None of these explanations exclude the others. A structure that first evolved for display can later acquire an aerodynamic role, and any larger membrane exposed to the air will affect both flight and body temperature. Some early depictions of the cliff racer give these vertical sails almost the same surface area as the wings. From a distance, a group of such animals could have looked less like a flock of birds and more like a field of narrow crescents moving across the evening sky. Yet, the strangest part of the cliff racer is not one of these elaborate structures. It is the complete absence of legs. There are no visible hind limbs beneath the body. No feet hang from the membrane. There are no toes, claws, or obvious vestigial stumps. The wings already occupy the position of the forelimbs. If the cliff racer descends from an ordinary four-limbed vertebrate, another pair of limbs should exist somewhere in its anatomy. Either the hind limbs were lost entirely, or they were transformed so completely that we no longer recognize them as legs. Before looking for them, we need to understand how an animal without feet lives. Living cliff racers are never seen standing on the ground. When they're not attacking, they hover in place or circle slowly through their territory. When prey approaches, they descend, strike and rise again. Only after death do they finally remain on the surface. Some caution is needed here. This behavior may simply reflect the limitations of the animation of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, rather than a strict law of cliff racer biology. A short landing sequence may simply never have been created. Still, the visible anatomy supports what we observe. An animal without external feet would have great difficulty standing, walking, or launching itself from level ground. Even if it could lower its body onto the surface, taking off again might be dangerous. For the adult cliff racer, remaining in the air may be safer than coming down. It also seems remarkably well adapted to doing so. The animal flaps its wings slowly for a creature of its size. It can remain almost stationary, then move forward while holding its wings in a largely fixed position. At times, it appears to float through the air with only minor corrections. A real flying animal must continuously produce enough lift to counter its weight. Hovering is especially expensive because the animal cannot rely on forward speed to keep air moving across the wings. Cliff racers appear to manage it with very little effort. Part of the answer may lie in ordinary anatomy. Their bones may be hollow or filled with air spaces. The torso is small compared to the total wing area, and much of the animal consists of thin membrane. Vardenfell itself would also help. Air forced against cliffs and mountain slopes rises upward. Volcanic terrain can produce strong thermal currents as the ground heats unevenly. A cliff racer circling above a ridge may be using slope lift in much the same way as a vulture or albatross, gaining altitude without continuous flapping. Its long tail and vertical sails could keep it stable when moving through turbulent air near rock faces. In a strong updraft, it might even appear to hover. These adaptations can explain efficient soaring. They have more difficulty explaining an animal hanging almost motionless in still air. This brings us back to the racer plume. When prepared by an alchemist, the plume can produce levitation. That property may come from a magical substance retained in the tissue after the animal's death. In the living racer, the same substance might reduce the effective pull of gravity. The wings would no longer need to support the animal's full weight. Instead, they could provide forward movement, steering, and enough lift to control altitude. A partially levitating animal could remain airborne with slower wing beats, hover for long periods, and recover more easily after losing speed. No surviving source explicitly says that cliff racers levitate naturally. The alchemical effect only makes the idea plausible. Even so, it fits the movement we observe surprisingly well. And life spent almost entirely in the air is not as unrealistic as it may first appear. Common swifts can remain airborne through almost their entire non-breeding season. Tracking studies found some individuals spending more than 99% of those 10 months in flight. They feed, migrate, and rest without returning to the ground. Alpine swifts have been tracked flying continuously for more than 200 days. Great frigate birds remain aloft for weeks at a time over the open ocean. Brain recordings have confirmed that they can even sleep while flying, usually in short episodes as they circle inside rising air. The sky can become a habitat in its own right. For these birds, landing is no longer part of their daily routine. It is mainly required for reproduction. The same problem would apply to cliff racers. Even the most aerial birds eventually return to a nest. They must lay eggs, incubate them, and raise young that cannot yet fly. A cliff racer may cling to a vertical rock face rather than stand on level ground. It may land only during breeding, perhaps in an awkward posture that would leave it vulnerable in the open. Females would retain eggs until they were close to hatching, or the species might give birth to live young. Juveniles may even possess temporary claws or limbs that disappear as they mature, helping them hold on to their mother. At present, all of this is speculation. There is at least one suggestive image. A creature called a cliff hunter appears in the Elder Scrolls legends, resting on the top of a narrow stone spire. It strongly resembles a cliff racer, though the different name means we cannot assume that it's the same animal. The image gives us one possible answer. Similar flying reptiles may use isolated rock pinnacles as resting sites, where a broad body and folded membranes are enough to maintain balance without ordinary feet. Remaining airborne for months is possible. Completing an entire life cycle without touching a solid surface is a much greater challenge. To see how close real evolution came to producing such an animal, we need to look at the cliff racer's most obvious analog. More than 200 million years before the modern world, the skies of Earth started to be occupied by pterosaurs. They were flying reptiles, though they were not dinosaurs. Pterosaurs belonged to the wider archosaur lineage and were close relatives of dinosaurs. Their wings consisted of skin, muscle, and connective tissue. The outer portion was supported by an extremely elongated fourth finger. The main wing membrane continued back toward the body and, in many species, attached near the hind limbs. The exact outline is still debated, and probably varied between different pterosaur groups. What is clear is that the hind limbs formed part of the complete flight apparatus. Every known pterosaur retained them. This makes the cliff racer a close visual match, with one major exception. Both animals possess membranous wings apparently supported by elongated digits. They have reptilian heads, lightweight bodies, and large display structures. Early pterosaurs also carried long tails with terminal veins. One of the clearest comparisons is Rhamphorhynchus. This Jurassic pterosaur had a long, stiffened tail ending in a diamond-shaped soft tissue vein. Several fossils preserve the vein itself, so it is not just a feature added by modern artists. In silhouette, Rhamphorhynchus comes close to the basic outline of a cliff racer: a narrow body, long wings, and a trailing tail ending in a broad control surface. It also shows the important difference. Beneath the wing membrane are two clearly developed legs. A later pterosaur called Nyctosaurus took aerial specialization much further. It had extremely long wings and proportionally small hind limbs. The first three fingers of the hand were also heavily reduced, leaving the elongated wing finger as the dominant structure. Some adult specimens possessed one of the most extravagant crests known in any vertebrate. 2 long bony branches rose from the skull, with the larger branch extending high above and behind the animal. The complete structure was almost 3 times the length of the skull itself. Artists often reconstruct a membrane stretched between the branches, producing a large sail above the head. Such a membrane is possible, and aerodynamic models have explored how it might affect flight. No real trace of that membrane has been found in the known fossils. The most conservative reconstruction therefore leaves the crest as a pair of exposed antler-like rods, perhaps covered by skin or keratin. Even without a sail, Pterosaurs shows what strong selection for aerial life can produce. The wings became enormous, the free fingers almost disappeared. The legs became small compared to the rest of the flight apparatus. They never vanished though. For a better example of a true soft tissue sail, we could turn to Tupendactylus. Its crest rose from the skull rather than the torso, but it was formed from both bone and a vast sheet of preserved soft tissue. Fibers within the crest helped support the membrane, and chemical evidence indicates that it carried pigment. It was probably a display structure, visible from great distance and perhaps used to identify species, age, or reproductive condition. A crest of this size looks impractical on a flying animal, yet it existed. Real pterosaurs carried structures every bit as excessive as the sails of the cliff racer, and some were much more imposing predators. Hatzegopteryx was a giant Asdarchid pterosaur from late Cretaceous Europe. It belonged to the same broad group as the enormous Quetzalcoatlus, but its skull was wider and more heavily built than the long, narrow heads associated with many other Asdarchids. Its neck was also unusually short and powerful. The vertebrae were constructed to resist strong bending and twisting forces. This has led some researchers to interpret Hatzegopteryx as a formidable terrestrial predator, capable of taking animals far larger than the fish or insects often associated with pterosaurs. We cannot observe its behavior directly. The anatomy, however, belonged to an animal that could apply considerable force through its head and neck. Real pterosaurs provide a counterpart for nearly every part of the cliff racer. They had membranous wings, long tail veins, enormous crests, soft tissue sails, reduced fingers, and bodies increasingly specialized for flight. They stop just short of the feature that interests us most. None lost its external hind limbs. If there is an answer to the seemingly missing hind limbs of the cliff racer, the best evidence for them will not come from Earth. It comes from earlier animals in Tamriel. No cliff racer skeleton is available for examination, and Tamriel's fossil record is frustratingly unhelpful. What we can do is compare the Third Era animal with other flying reptiles seen across Morrowind. The oldest possible relative appears in the writings of Topal the Pilot, an Aldmeri explorer of the Merethic era. Topal describes a bat lizard as large as a ship. Later commentators have sometimes connected this creature with the ancestry of cliff racers. The account is far from reliable zoological evidence. It is ancient, written in verse, and likely exaggerated. The bat lizard may have been a giant flying reptile, a dragon, or something else entirely. The clearer comparisons come from the Second Era. Cliff striders inhabited Vardenfell during this period. They share several features with cliff racers: a narrow-toothed beak, leathery wings, a small cranial crest, and a tall sail rising from the back. Their legs, however, are impossible to miss. Cliff striders walk and fight on the ground. Their hind limbs are large, muscular, and fully exposed. The wings appear less suited to sustained flight, giving the animal the appearance of a terrestrial predator that still retains some aerial ability. They may belong to a nearby branch of the same wider group. Their anatomy offers a possible starting point: a four-limbed animal with wings, feet, and no difficulty using the ground. Farther south, in Black Marsh, we find the hackwing. Hackwings are flying reptiles with long saw-like beaks. They travel in flocks and attack by making repeated passes, wounding prey before withdrawing and waiting for blood loss to weaken it. Their bodies look reptilian, yet they produce feather-like material. Cliff racers show a similar combination of leathery skin and plume-like structures. Hackwings may be distant relatives of the Vardenfell animals. They may also have evolved similar features independently. Flight often pushes unrelated animals towards similar shapes. Cliff darters form another branch of Morrowind's aerial fauna. These are smaller animals with feathered wings and clearly visible clawed feet. They feed on vermin and can be useful around settlements, despite their persistent screeching. Together, these species show that Morrowind supports a wide range of animals combining reptilian and avian features. The cliff racers did not evolve in isolation. The most revealing comparison is the cliff racer itself. During the Second Era, Vardenfell was already home to an animal carrying that name. It has the same general arrangement of a narrow head, membranous wings, long tail and vertical body structures. There is one obvious difference. The Second Era cliff racer has hind limbs. They are not as free or as robust as those of a cliff strider. The legs appear closely bound to the rear wing membrane, with little sign that the feet could support ordinary walking. Their position increases the surface area of the wing. By extending away from the pelvis, the legs hold the posterior membrane outward and prevent it from collapsing against the body. This resembles one of the roles played by the hind limbs of real pterosaurs. A leg can lose much of its value for walking while remaining useful in flight. The Second Era cliff racer may already be partway through that transition. Now we can return to the Third Era animal. If its wing were a simple membrane stretched from the long outer finger directly to the side of the torso, the rear edge should follow a fairly straight path between those 2 points. It does not. The membrane extends farther behind the body, as though some unseen structure is holding it outward. The model is simple, and this shape may have no intentional anatomical meaning, but if you treat the outline literally, it offers a place for the missing legs to hide. The hind limbs may have become internal support within the wing. Over time, the femur could have shortened and moved closer to the pelvis. The joints may have lost most of their mobility. The lower leg could then fuse into a rigid rod, while the toes gradually disappeared. Buried inside the patagium, the remaining structure would no longer resemble a leg. It would act more like a spar inside an aircraft wing, or a tent pole holding a fabric under tension. Its purpose would be to spread the posterior membrane, increasing the wing's surface area and control the shape of the trailing edge. This would mean that the cliff racer never lost its hind limbs completely. It repurposed them. The process could begin with a cliff strider-like ancestor that walked on large, functional legs. In a more aerial descendant, the membrane would extend farther toward those limbs. Walking would become less important as the legs took on a greater role in supporting the wing. The feet would shrink, the joints would stiffen. Eventually the bones would become enclosed within the membrane and disappear from external view. The final animal could no longer stand in a conventional posture. It would gain a broader wing and a body built around permanent flight. This remains a theory. Without a skeleton, the hidden structure could just as easily be cartilage, a thick tendon, or nothing more than an artifact of the 3D model. Still, the visible hind limbs of the Second Era form make the idea more than an anatomical guess. We can see an earlier version in which the legs are already closely incorporated into the wing. This also creates a problem for classification. The cliff racers of the Second and Third Eras differ substantially. They may represent one lineage changing over time, separate species within the same group, regional forms, or unrelated animals carrying the same common name. A few centuries would be a short period for such dramatic change under ordinary evolution. Strong selective pressure could accelerate the process, and Tamrielic magic makes firm biological limits difficult to establish. There may also have been another influence. We know that someone was deliberately trying to create a better flying predator. During the Second Era, a breeder in Balmora named Thetis Ramaris was working with Bitter Coast cliff striders. His ambition was unusually specific. "I love our Bitter Coast striders, but feel bad that they can't fly very well. So I'm selectively breeding them into a strain that, one day, will dominate the Vardenfell skies, pursuing its prey for great distances." The statement concerns cliff striders. It does not say that Thetis created cliff racers, and cliff racers already existed during his lifetime. What it does show is that a breeder was selecting related flying reptiles for the exact traits that would later make the Third Era cliff racers infamous: stronger flight and long-distance pursuit. Perhaps his strain failed. Perhaps it remained confined to a small private collection. It may also have escaped, interbred with wild animals, or inspired later breeders. We have no direct link between his project and the cliff racers encountered centuries later. But the possibility is difficult to ignore. Artificial selection can reshape an animal quickly when breeders consistently favor the same traits. Larger wings, great aggression, and the willingness to follow prey over long distances would all be useful in the kind of animal Thetis wanted. Reduced dependence on the ground could follow. Animals that remain airborne longer would need less terrestrial mobility, allowing the hind limbs to become increasingly dedicated to the wing. The late Third Era cliff racer may have reached this form through natural specialization. A breeding program may have also helped push one local population in the same direction. Whatever produced them, the resulting animals were extremely effective at finding travelers. A cliff racer can detect movement from a considerable distance. In the fog of Vardenfell, it may notice a person long before the person notices it. The hunt begins quietly. Somewhere beyond the visible terrain, the animal turns and begins to follow. Cliff racers are persistent, though not especially fast. A traveler may continue along the road and leave the animal far behind. For a while, the danger appears to have passed. But the racer does not give up. It keeps moving toward the target, crossing hills, marshes, and rocky ground that would stop a terrestrial predator. It may arrive several minutes later, perhaps after the traveler has entered another fight or reached what seemed to be a safe destination. The animal's strategy resembles persistent tracking rather than a brief ambush. It is also remarkably close to the goal described by Thetis Ramaris, a predator capable of pursuing prey across great distances. One cliff racer is often only the beginning. A second racer catches up, then a third. Others remain somewhere in the fog behind them. A group can form without any true pack coordination, created by several stubborn animals refusing to abandon the same target. For an inexperienced traveler, even one cliff racer can be dangerous. Later, after better weapons and stronger magic become available, each individual animal becomes little more than an interruption. The interruption never goes away. The racer stays above difficult terrain, follows across long distances, and announces every attack with the same unmistakable call. Its ability to remain irritating long after it stops being threatening may explain why players remember the cliff racer more vividly than many stronger creatures. For the ordinary people of Vardenfell, the situation would be less amusing. A trader or farmer cannot destroy a swarm with a single spell. Flying predators can avoid rough terrain, attack isolated roads, and follow victims who have no safe place to hide. Killing individual racers would do little when the species remained common across the island. The cliff racer had become more than another predator within the ecosystem. It was a persistent threat to travel and settlement. Eventually, one Dunmer decided that the island would be better without it. Jiub is the first person we meet upon arriving on Vardenfell.
Now, what was it I said to that prisoner? Stand up. There you go. You're dreaming. Yes, that was it.
At the time, he is simply another prisoner being transported by the Empire. We know little about him, and after leaving the ship, his path separates from ours. Years later, Jiub would become one of the most celebrated figures in recent Dunmer history. His soul eventually came to rest in the Soul Cairn, where he tells the Dragonborn how it happened.
Ah, yes. Say Jiub, Jiub the Eradicator, Jiub the Magnificent. I've earned a lot of those titles thanks to my campaign against the Winged Menace. Yes, I'm speaking of the Cliff Racer, of course. Wretched things. They used to crisscross the skies over Morrowind like vermin. Nasty flying creatures with a habit of sneaking up on the unwary. After I was freed from prison, I decided to turn my life around. Give something back to the people of Morrowind. It became quickly apparent that the best way I could help would be by wiping out the Cliff Racers. Indeed I was. I hunted down and killed every last one of them. Took years. The people of Morrowind were so grateful to have the roads safer again, they took to calling me Saint Jiub, and then the other names followed.
Jiub's story fits the animal we have observed. He remembers a predator that appeared without warning, followed travelers, and made the roads unsafe. His campaign took years, suggesting a systematic effort rather than one particularly productive afternoon with a bow. The strongest part of the account is also the most difficult to accept literally. He killed every last one. Jiub is proud of his achievement. By the time we meet him again, he is writing an autobiography planned to fill 26 volumes. His version of events is unlikely to understate anything. The statement also leaves two important questions unanswered. Where did he search, and what exactly did he count as a cliff racer? Another account gives us a narrower answer. During the events of Oblivion, people speak about Jiub's death.
Many are dead in the land of the Dunmer. Even Saint Jiub, who drove the cliff racers from Vardenfell, has fallen to the Daedra hordes.
This version does not say that Jiub removed cliff racers from every part of Morrowind. It names Vardenfell. The distinction matters. Vardenfell is the large island at the center of the province. Mainland Morrowind extends around it, with additional islands and remote coastal regions beyond Jiub's known campaign. Removing an animal from one island is not the same as destroying the species. Biologists call the first event local extinction. A population disappears from one part of its range while others survive elsewhere. Jiub is firmly credited with driving cliff racers from Vardenfell. He may have even killed the final member of the familiar Third Era population. That achievement alone would explain his sainthood. The roads became safer, the attacks ended, and an animal hated across Vardenfell disappeared. Nothing in the more precise accounts proves that Jiub searched mainland Morrowind, every neighboring island, or every remote mountain valley. His campaign probably ended the Vardenfell population. The fate of the wider species is less certain. Cliff racers were abundant in the Third Era, year 427, when the Nerevarine arrived on Vardenfell. Jiub began his campaign after leaving prison. Within a few years, he had become famous for removing them from the island. He later died during the destruction of Kvatch at the end of the Third Era. Skyrim takes place in the Fourth Era, year 201, a little more than 2 centuries after our first arrival in Morrowind. By then, the Cliff Racer should have been a creature of history. Mjol the Lioness remembers otherwise.
When I was young, I journeyed with my father on hunting expeditions into Morrowind. The Cliff Racers made for excellent sport.
Mjol is a Nord living in the Fourth Era, so her childhood occurred long after Jiub's campaign. She describes living animals. They were numerous enough, or at least reliable enough, to serve as hunting quarry. This is the clearest evidence that something called a Cliff Racer survived. Her statement is also limited. Mjol says that the expedition took place in Morrowind. She never mentions Vardenfell. She gives no physical description and does not tell us how common the animals were. Her account is anecdotal, though there is no positive reason to treat it as a lie. She may simply be describing a population that lived outside Jiub's hunting grounds. Another Fourth Era reference appears in Bjormund's diary. For someone who winces at the sight of cliff racers, The idea of this monstrosity soaring through the sky made my heart tremble. This line tells us that cliff racers remained familiar enough to serve as an immediate comparison. Bjormund may have seen them himself. He may have also known them through stories, family memory, or reports from elsewhere in Morrowind. It supports Mjol's testimony, though it is less direct than an account of actually hunting them. The simplest solution is geographical. Jiub eliminated the Vardenfell population. Cliff racers on mainland Morrowind survived. Mjol and her father later hunted those mainland animals. This explanation allows Jiub's achievement to remain real. He cleared the island and made its roads safe. His phrase, "every last one," referred to the population he had spent years pursuing. It also allows Mjol's memory to remain accurate. She never claimed to have hunted them on Vardenfell. A second possibility is that Jiub missed a small remnant population. A few animals may have survived in isolated mountains, on small islands, or along inaccessible cliffs. Over the next 2 centuries, those survivors could have reproduced and spread. A flying animal can recolonize territory more easily than one confined by rivers, mountains, and broken ground. This requires Jiub's claim to be an exaggeration, though perhaps only a minor one. He may have believed the final animal was dead because no one encountered another for many years. There is also the taxonomic problem we encountered earlier. The animals hunted by Mjol may not have been the same species as the late Third Era cliff racer. Second Era cliff racers already differ in a major part of their anatomy. Morrowind also contains cliff striders, cliff darters, and other flying reptiles with overlapping features. Common names are rarely precise. A hunter may call any large, aggressive, flying reptile with a long tail a cliff racer, especially if the original animal has been absent for generations. Under this interpretation, Jiub could have destroyed the exact population familiar from Morrowind. A related species survived elsewhere and inherited its name. Without a 4th Era specimen, a skeleton, or even a detailed description, we cannot choose between these possibilities with certainty. There is little reason to accuse Mjol of inventing the story. There is also no need to imagine that a completely extinct species somehow returned. The evidence fits a more ordinary chain of events. Jiub removed cliff racers from Vardenfell. Populations survived elsewhere in Morrowind, or a close relative continued under the same name. 2 centuries later, those animals were still available to hunters. Jiub succeeded. His account was simply more local than his own account suggests. The familiar Third Era cliff racer may genuinely be extinct. Its broad wings, hidden hind limbs, and vertical sails may no longer cross the skies above any part of Tamriel. Or somewhere beyond Vardenfell, among the mountains and broken coasts of mainland Morrowind, its descendants may still be circling. For now, the skies above the island remain quiet. The swarms that once followed travelers through ash and fog are gone. Jiub kept that part of his promise. But Vardenfell is not all of Morrowind, and silence in one place does not prove that the winged menace disappeared everywhere. While considering what may still hunt above the mainland roads, other animals begin to draw our attention. The drag beneath the water, the Quama colonies under the ash, the Netch drifting quietly above the marshes. Vardenfell still holds much of its natural history out of sight. But that will have to wait until the next expedition.